Mail-order bride rejected for being too smart, until a feared gunslinger fought to keep her alive. The small town of Haven's Edge sat on the edge of the galaxy, a place where the frontier felt endless, and the stars above were the only light. Dust blew through the streets, stirring up the dry red soil that covered the ground. Haven's Edge was a tough place. People came here to escape, to survive, or to start fresh, but it wasn't a place where weakness was allowed. On a hot afternoon, a rusty transport ship landed with a heavy thud, its engines sputtering before they died down. From the ship's ramp, a lone figure stepped out. Ella Carver was different from everyone else in the town. She wasn't wearing a long, dusty coat or a wide-brimmed hat. Instead, she wore a simple dress. Clean, practical, but far too refined for this rough, dirty place. Her boots clicked on the hard ground as she stepped down from the ramp. She looked around, feeling the weight of the heat press on her skin. The town looked smaller than she expected, just a few buildings and a few dozen people moving about their business. Ella had traveled far to reach this point. She had answered an ad, one of many, that promised a new life as a bride. She wasn't expecting much, but she wasn't expecting this either. The men who were supposed to greet her seemed to disappear into the background. She had been told she'd meet her husband-to-be as soon as she arrived, but there was no sign of him. Ella paused, squinting into the sun. There was a man at the edge of the landing field watching her. He was tall, with a hard face and a heavy coat, but his eyes weren't filled with warmth. She didn't know who he was, but she felt like she did. This was the man she had come here for. The man who was supposed to be her new husband. Frank Donovan. She had read his name 1,000 times, written to him through long-distance messages, but nothing had prepared her for the way he looked in person. He didn't smile. His face was stone cold, his hands crossed over his chest as he studied her. "Ella Carver?" he asked, his voice deep and rough. She nodded, taking a step toward him. "Yes, I'm Ella. You're the one who's too smart, huh?" Ella froze. The words hit her like a slap. She tried to smile, though her cheeks burned. I don't understand. I don't... Donovan shook his head. "I don't need a woman who thinks she knows everything." I didn't ask for someone with your qualities. She had heard rumors of men rejecting women for things like this. She had hoped it wasn't true, that her sharp mind and ability to think for herself would be valued. But here, in the heart of the frontier, it seemed to be a weakness. Ella glanced around, realizing that more eyes were on her. The settlers and ranchers had gathered, watching this strange scene unfold. A woman, rejected before she could even take a step toward her new life. "I'm sorry, but I can't marry you," Donovan said, his voice devoid of any compassion. "I don't want a woman who's smarter than me." Her stomach twisted. She had come all this way hoping for a fresh start, and now she stood in front of this man. Rejected, unwanted. There was nothing left for her here. She could leave, but where would she go? She had no family left, no home. She had nowhere to run. As Donovan turned to leave, Ella swallowed her tears. She wasn't going to cry. She had to survive. That's what she had always done. Survive. She looked around at the others, hoping someone might help, but no one moved. No one spoke up. Frank Donovan was a powerful man in this town. If he didn't want her, then no one did. Ella stood there for what felt like hours, the dust swirling around her feet, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. Suddenly, there was a loud sound of hooves in the distance. Ella looked up to see a figure riding toward her, his silhouette sharp against the bright sky. The rider was tall, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He rode in with the confidence of someone who didn't fear anything, someone used to being in control. The rider pulled his horse to a stop in front of her, kicking up a cloud of dust. He dismounted with fluid movement, his boots hitting the ground heavily. Ella took a step back. There was something about this man that made her feel uneasy. His eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but she could feel his gaze on her. He was no ordinary man. There was something cold about him, something dangerous. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Ella looked up at him, trying to gather her thoughts. I don't know. I was rejected by him." The man glanced over at Frank Donovan, who was still walking away without a care in the world. The gunslinger's lips twitched, and he shook his head. "That man's a fool," the gunslinger said, his tone full of distaste. "No one's ever rejected a woman for being too smart." "That's just plain wrong." Ella wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't know who this man was, but she knew he didn't have the cold distance that Donovan had. There was something more genuine about him, even though he looked like he could tear anyone apart if needed. The gunslinger offered a small smirk. Name's Caleb Wyatt, but most call me Red. Don't let Donovan's rejection get to you. You're better off without him. Ella felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. I need to get out of here, she said, her voice shaky but determined.
Red nodded.
You've got a good head on your shoulders. We can figure out what's next. For the first time since she'd arrived, Ella felt a small glimmer of possibility. She wasn't sure how she'd survive in this tough town, but for the first time, someone had shown her kindness. Someone had seen her worth, not for what she could do for him, but for who she was. And with Red at her side, maybe, just maybe, she could find her place in this wild, unforgiving world. Ella stood beside Caleb Red Wyatt, watching as Frank Donovan and the rest of the settlers walked away. The air felt thick with the dust of the frontier, but Ella's thoughts were even heavier. She had just been rejected, not because of her looks or anything she could change, but because she was too smart. She felt like she didn't belong here, in this harsh, unforgiving town. Red, who had introduced himself as a gunslinger, was standing next to her, his sharp eyes scanning the town with a quiet intensity. Ella wasn't sure what to make of him yet. He was dangerous. She could tell that just from his movements, the way he carried himself. But there was something different about him. He wasn't like the other men in the town, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Ella felt she could trust him. What happens now? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Red glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Well, that depends on you. This town's not going to change overnight. But you don't have to be part of it anymore. You've got options. Ella swallowed hard, the reality of her situation setting in. I don't know if I have any options. I came here for a new life, and now I'm stuck. You don't need Donovan or anyone else here. I can see that you've got a good mind, and that's worth more than most men give credit for. Ella nodded, though the weight of everything was still heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't go back home. There was nothing left for her there. But here? This was a strange, dangerous place. She wasn't sure she could survive on her own. Red seemed to notice her hesitation and offered her a small, wry smile. You're going to have to trust me. Stick with me for a while. I'll show you how to survive. Ella hesitated, but she nodded. She had no other choice. All right, she said. I'll stay with you. Red led her down the main street of Haven's Edge, his pace steady and sure. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rough town. But despite the beauty of the setting, the town felt like a place that had given up. The buildings were weathered, their windows cracked, and the people who walked the streets looked tired and worn as if they'd lost all hope. Ella couldn't help but notice how people glanced at her and Red as they passed by. Their stares weren't friendly, but they weren't outright hostile either. They just seemed curious. Whispers followed them as they walked. She could feel eyes on her back, but she kept her head high and walked alongside Red. They arrived at a small saloon near the edge of town. The wooden sign creaked in the wind, but the door was open, and the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted out. Red turned to Ella. You'll be safe here for now. Stay inside. Don't go anywhere alone. Ella nodded. She wasn't used to being told what to do, but Red had a way about him that made her trust his words. I'll be careful, she said. Inside, the saloon smelled of smoke, cheap whiskey, and something faintly sweet. The dim light cast long shadows on the walls, and the few people inside didn't pay much attention to her or Red. They were lost in their own worlds, nursing drinks or talking quietly. Ella walked to a small table by the corner, keeping her head down. She didn't want to draw attention. She'd already made a bad first impression on the town, and she wasn't sure she could handle any more judgment. Red made his way to the bar and ordered a drink. As he sipped it, his eyes scanned the room, looking for something, or someone. Ella couldn't figure him out. He was a mystery, like a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. After a while, Red returned to her table, sitting down across from her. I'm going to need you to help me with something, he said, his voice low. Ella raised an eyebrow. What do you need help with? Red took another sip from his drink. I've been tracking a group of raiders. They've been causing trouble in the area, and I've been asked to deal with them. But I need someone who can read and think, someone like you. I'm going to need you to help me figure out their plans. Ella stared at him, shocked. Raiders? You're hunting them down? That's right, Red said simply. They're dangerous. I'm not the only one who's been asked to deal with them, but I plan to finish the job. And I'm going to need your help. Ella looked down at the table, her thoughts racing. She had no experience with things like this. She was smart, sure, but this wasn't a problem she could solve by reading books or doing research. But something about Red's calm confidence made her feel like maybe she could. Maybe she could be part of something bigger than herself. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, meeting his gaze. Red's eyes locked onto hers. "I need you to look over some messages I intercepted. You've got a good mind for puzzles, right? I've been following their movements, but there's something I'm missing. You can help me figure it out." Ella hesitated, but she knew she couldn't back down now. She wasn't just some helpless woman waiting to be rescued. She had something to offer. "All right," she said. "I'll help you." Red leaned back in his chair, looking at her with approval. "Good. I knew you had it in you." The next few days were a blur of tense silence and long hours of reading through intercepted messages. Ella spent hours poring over the cryptic words, piecing together information about the raiders' plans. It was hard work, and there were moments when she felt frustrated, but each time she thought she was stuck, she found another clue that led her closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Red kept his distance. He would come and go, always watching over her, but he never pushed her. He let her work at her own pace. On the third day, Ella finally cracked the code. She found the location of the raiders' base, a hidden camp deep in the desert, far from any civilization. It was exactly the break Red needed. "We've got them," Ella said, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "They're camped out near the old mining tunnels. It's isolated, and they've been moving in and out under cover of darkness." Red looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nice work, Ella. You're sharper than I thought." Ella felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since she'd arrived in Haven's Edge, she felt like she was doing something important. She wasn't just the too smart woman who was unwanted. She was someone who could make a difference. Red stood up, his movements deliberate. "We leave at dawn. Get some rest. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Ella nodded. She wasn't sure what the future held, but with Red by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The sun rose slowly over the rugged landscape of Haven's Edge, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. Ella Carver stood outside the small cabin she had been staying in, watching as Red prepared their horses. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the relentless heat of the day before. But even with the calm morning, Ella felt a surge of nervous energy. Today was the day they would finally confront the raiders, the dangerous men who had been causing trouble in the region. Ella had spent the last few days working with Red, studying the intercepted messages, figuring out the raiders' movements, and mapping out their base. She had never imagined that this would be her life, hunting down criminals in a dusty town on the edge of the galaxy. But she had learned more than she ever thought possible in such a short time. Red had trusted her, and she had proved herself useful. Now they were about to head out, determined to put an end to the raiders' reign of terror. Red was already mounted, his silhouette dark against the early morning sky. His face was unreadable as usual, but Ella could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't a man to back down from a fight, and today he was going to make sure the raiders wouldn't threaten the people of Haven's Edge anymore. "Ready?" Red's voice broke through her thoughts. Ella nodded, taking a deep breath. Ready. She had never ridden far out into the desert, but the terrain felt oddly familiar. It was wide and open, the dry brush and jagged rocks stretching as far as the eye could see. The horses moved with ease, their hooves kicking up dust as they traveled along the worn path that led them deeper into the wilderness. As they rode, Ella couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and fear. This wasn't what she had expected when she had first come to Haven's Edge. She hadn't imagined herself out here, in the desert, with a gunslinger chasing down criminals. But now that she was here, now that she had seen the damage the raiders had done, she understood the importance of what they were doing. The ride was long and quiet, with only the sound of the wind and the horses' hooves breaking the silence. Ella's thoughts drifted back to the town. There were still people who didn't trust her, who saw her as nothing more than a too-smart woman. But then there were others, like Red, who had given her a chance to prove herself. He had seen her potential, and that gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Hours passed, and the desert stretched out endlessly before them. Ella knew they were getting close to the raiders' base when she noticed the change in the landscape. The air was thick with dust, and the ground was uneven, with jagged rocks and deep ravines cutting through the land. It was clear that no one had traveled this way in a long time. "This is it," Red said, breaking the silence. "We're close." Ella looked ahead, trying to see what he saw, but all she could make out was a rocky outcrop in the distance. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The time had come. There was no turning back now. They slowed their horses as they approached the outcrop, moving carefully to avoid detection. Red's eyes were constantly scanning the landscape, looking for signs of movement. Ella's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen. What if they weren't ready? What if the raiders were more dangerous than they had thought? "Stay close," Red ordered quietly. "Don't make a sound." Ella nodded, gripping the reins tightly. They had to be smart about this. The raiders had to be caught off guard, and they had to be careful. One wrong move could mean disaster. As they neared the outcrop, Red held up his hand, signaling Ella to stop. He dismounted, moving quickly and quietly toward the rocks. Ella followed, staying low to the ground, her senses alert. They crouched behind a large boulder, and Red peered around the corner. "There," Red whispered. "I see them. They're camped up ahead, just over that ridge." Ella's eyes followed the direction Red pointed. She could make out the shadowy figures of the raiders gathered around a campfire. They looked relaxed, unprepared for a fight. This was their chance. Red turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm going to go in first. I'll draw their attention. You stay here, keep watch. Once I've got them distracted, you move in." "Got this, Ella." Ella nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was ready. She had never been in a real fight before, and the thought of facing the raiders made her stomach twist. But she knew what was at stake. The people of Haven's Edge were depending on them. Red stood up, moving swiftly and silently. He disappeared behind the ridge, and Ella held her breath, waiting. She could hear the faint sounds of Red's voice, then the sharp crack of gunfire. The raiders were alerted, shouting in surprise. "Get ready!" Red's voice rang out. "They're coming for us!" Ella's heart raced. She gripped her rifle tightly, steadying her hands. She had practiced with the gun, but now it felt heavier than ever. The raiders were closing in, and she had to be ready. A figure appeared over the ridge, running toward her. Ella's instincts kicked in. She raised her rifle and aimed. The raider didn't see her until it was too late. With a single shot, he fell, crashing to the ground. Ella's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. More raiders came, but Red was already in the thick of the fight, his guns blazing. He moved like lightning, his eyes never leaving his targets. Ella fired again, taking down another raider who had tried to flank Red. It was chaos. The desert echoed with the sound of gunfire, and the ground trembled beneath their feet as they fought. Ella could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, pushing her to keep fighting. She wasn't just some too-smart woman anymore. She was part of this. She was helping, and that made all the difference. The battle raged on, but slowly the tide turned. Red's expert marksmanship and Ella's quick thinking kept the raiders off balance. One by one, the raiders fell, until only a few remained. Red's eyes locked onto the last raider, a tall, muscular man who was trying to make a run for it. Without hesitation, Red raised his gun and fired. The raider dropped to the ground, never even having a chance to fight back. Breathing heavily, Red walked over to Ella. His eyes were filled with approval. "Nice shooting, Ella," he said, his voice steady. Ella looked down at the fallen raiders, her heart still racing. She had done it. She had helped take down the gang that had been terrorizing the town. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't what she had expected when she first arrived in Haven's Edge, but she had proven to herself that she belonged. "I couldn't have done it without you," Ella said, her voice filled with awe. Red smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his usual hard expression. "You've got more in you than you know." As the dust settled and the last of the raiders were taken care of, Ella felt a sense of pride swell within her. She had fought, and she had won. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she truly belonged. The desert sky was turning deep purple as the sun sank behind the jagged mountains. Ella Carver stood beside Red, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The raiders they had faced earlier were no longer a threat. Their bodies scattered across the dry earth, but the weight of what they had done still hung in the air. The tension of the battle, the rush of survival, it was all slowly fading, replaced by a sense of quiet, almost peaceful relief. But that didn't mean it was over. Red, his face still hard and unreadable, turned to her. "We've done what we came for. The raiders won't be causing any more problems for the town." Ella nodded, her breath steadying. She had helped Red track down the gang, had fought alongside him, and now they were standing in the middle of the desert, their mission complete. But even as the danger passed, Ella knew the hardest part was just beginning. She had seen the looks the settlers had given her back in town, the way they had whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. They hadn't wanted her from the start. She was too smart, too different, too much of an outsider. Could they accept her now? Red's voice broke her thoughts. "Come on, let's get back to town. We've got some talking to do." The ride back was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Ella couldn't stop thinking about the battle. It had been her first real fight, and although she had followed Red's lead, she knew it was a moment that would change her. She had proven to herself and to him that she wasn't just a woman who could think her way out of problems. She could fight, too. As they entered Haven's Edge, the town still felt the same, dusty, worn, and on the edge of collapse. But something had changed. Ella wasn't just the too-smart woman anymore. She had become something more. Someone who could hold her ground. Who could stand beside a man like Red and not just survive, but thrive. They rode to the saloon, the familiar building standing tall against the darkening sky. Inside, the sounds of conversation and laughter filled the air. But as soon as Ella stepped through the door, everything went quiet. All eyes turned to her, and the weight of their gazes pressed down on her. For a moment she felt small again, that same sting of rejection creeping in. But then Red walked in beside her, his presence as powerful as ever. The room seemed to exhale, and the tension in the air lifted slightly. A gruff voice came from the back of the room. "Well, look who's back." "I didn't think we'd see you again, Ella." Ella turned toward the voice and saw Frank Donovan leaning against the bar, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look at her with the same cold indifference as before, but there was still a hint of something in his eyes, something that Ella couldn't quite place. "I came back to finish what I started," Ella said, her voice steady, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. "I'm not just a woman who's too smart for this place. I'm here because I have something to offer." "Oh? And what's that?" Ella took a step forward, her posture straightening. "I've seen what you all face out here. The raiders, the hardships, the isolation. I've helped take down a gang that's been terrorizing this town. I've shown that I can be more than just a mail-order bride. I can help you build something better, something stronger." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Ella could feel the eyes on her, but this time they weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with curiosity. Red stood behind her, arms crossed. "Ella's right. We all have our strengths. She's got a hell of a mind, and she's not afraid to use it. She's helped us survive, and she can help this town too." He looked at Ella, then at Red, then back at the others in the room. The silence stretched on for a long moment, but finally Frank pushed himself off the bar and walked over to Ella. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice softer than before. "I didn't think I'd ever say this, but maybe you do have something to offer." She wasn't sure if this was what she had hoped for, but it was better than the rejection she had gotten when she first arrived. Frank wasn't the only one who needed to come to terms with who she was. She had to accept herself, too. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," Frank continued, "but we need someone who can think things through, and we need someone who knows how to get things done." "I can do that," Frank nodded. "All right, then. Let's see what we can build together." Over the next few days, the town began to change. Ella worked alongside Red, using her knowledge to help the settlers improve their defenses and make plans for a better future. She wasn't just the outsider anymore. She was a part of something bigger, a team working together to survive and thrive. Red stayed by her side, offering guidance when needed, but also giving her space to prove herself. The more they worked together, the more Ella realized that Red wasn't just a gunslinger. He was a man who understood what it meant to fight for something worth protecting. And that, in a way, was the same thing she was learning to do. The settlers, too, began to warm up to Ella. It wasn't easy, and not everyone was willing to accept her right away, but as she continued to help them, they started to see the value she brought. She wasn't just a too-smart woman. She was a woman who had faced the harshest challenges and had come out on top. She was a woman who had proven that intelligence, strength, and courage could all work together. It wasn't long before the people of Haven's Edge began to look at Ella differently. They no longer saw her as a threat or an outsider. They saw her as a leader, someone who had helped them survive when they had thought they had no chance. And for Ella, that was everything. One evening, as she stood outside the saloon looking up at the stars, Red walked over and stood beside her. "You did good, Ella," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Ella smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Red didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking up at the stars with her. And for the first time, Ella felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She wasn't just a mail-order bride anymore. She was someone who had built her own future, someone who had fought for her place and earned her right to be here. She wasn't alone anymore. And as she stood there, with Red by her side and the town of Haven's Edge finally beginning to embrace her, Ella knew that no matter what challenges came next, she would be ready. Because now she knew what it meant to survive and to thrive.